Hey, what's up, fellas? Got a little something going on for Scott tonight. He was trying to find a cheap way to heat his shop with waste oil. So I built him this waste oil heater setup. Essentially, it's just a beer keg with one of my foundry burners. And I need to show him how to run this thing. Essentially, we're using a leaf blower to power the air because a traditional combustion blower can run anywhere from $200 to $2,000. So this is like a $25 blower that can be replaced if it breaks. And we're going to be running that off of a triac circuit. This is similar to a router speed controller, but a little bit more industrial. Now, when you go to light this thing, you have to use the most minimal air you can get this thing to pump to where it's just barely spinning. Okay, so I am a terrible cameraman, but as you can see, the thing lights right up. Just get it up to about 150 PSI. And then once you get the air blower turned up a little bit, there's really not a big flame sticking out the front of it. You can slide this thing right into position with no problem at all. You cannot have the blower on hardly at all during ignition. You would essentially just be taking a blowtorch, inserting it into the end, and just doing that. And you'll learn how to light this thing after a couple of times to where you've only got a flame about this big coming out of it. And it doesn't put off a lot of smoke or nothing like that when you're lighting it. I'll try and find some clips of this thing firing up, but after you get it lit, you're gonna wanna have gloves on and all that. You'll just slide it back in place. And this right here is just a flue collar that'll allow you to take a 6-inch flue and strap this thing right to it. It's got a piece of hard welded stainless steel underneath there. Now that's going to burn all the galvanize off of there, but once it gets up and running, you could spray paint it with some of that high temp spray paint to keep it from rusting to death on you. Other than that, as far as the fuel goes, this has a 1.5 gallon per hour Delavan 80 degree B cone nozzle on here. And one of the things about these nozzles is that they will not atomize the oil if the oil is not hot. So you come into the shop 5 degrees below, you're gonna have to have an oil heater. So that's what I've set you up with here. This is a high powered oil heater though. So in most cases, you're not gonna wanna run it over 136 watts. You might wanna get one of these little plug-in watt meters to run with it. I have this thing set at 5.5 on the dial, and that comes right out to about 136 watts. But as I said, when it's like 5 below in your shop, when you come out there in the morning to turn on the heat, 136 watts might not be enough to do that. So you're going to want to crank it up a little bit. This thing can do 1,500 watts. You don't ever want to run it that high. In fact, once you get up to about 500 watts, it'll start to boil gases out of the oil and you'll get bubbles in the line. So I don't recommend going over 500 watts, but it's nice to have the power there when you need it. This little port right here to that connector on the burner itself. And this right here is the fuel flow valve for that. So to get our fuel pressure, we are again kind of saving Scott some money here. And we're just going to be using this here pressure washer. Sometimes you want to go higher than what a conventional oil pump can give you. If you go buy a oil furnace oil pump off the market right now for a cool 300 bucks, it's only going to give you about 100 to 150 PSIs in most cases. Some of those just don't turn up the way you need them to. This right here gives us the option to run at up to 500 PSIs with no problem whatsoever. And the reason you would want to do that is because when you pump higher pressure through a small nozzle, you get better atomization. So, and the way we're going to pump this fuel is with something called a bypass valve. The flow rate of this pump is obviously too much for the 1.5 gallon per minute nozzle. Even though this says 1.2, that's at 1700 PSIs. We're only running about 200 in most cases. So we have this valve here on the back end of the intake that once we get it running, we're going to open this valve to about the halfway point or so. And most of the flow rate is going to travel in a loop right back into the intake. And that's how we deal with the flow rate issue. By toggling this valve to the fully closed position, we get maximum pressure. And by opening it all the way, we get minimal pressure. To prime the pump, when we first go to start it, you're going to want to dump a little oil inside of this port by taking this apart. You wouldn't want to have it connected yet. Dump a little oil in there so the pump don't run dry. You have to have this bypass valve closed to get the pump to prime. Otherwise, it's just pulling air through itself in a loop like a little air pump. So this has to be closed. This is the oil filter that I'm giving you. And one of the things about waste oil that you've got to know when you're running these types of nozzles is that you're going to want to get a centrifuge filter at the end of the day. If you don't, what'll happen is something called nozzle erosion. Now, this could take a year or so to happen, but the nozzle will erode itself out from all the dirt particles in there. And also, waste oil has got a lot of dirt and sludge in it that these nozzles cannot atomize, and they can clog them up. So if it goes out on you and you don't know why, you probably got some gunk inside of either this filter. And I've shown that gunk in some of the videos. There's ways to get rid of it. You just have to pre-filter the oil. You can't just throw dirty, nasty oil into a tank and stick this hose in here and run this thing. It'll run for 4 or 5 hours, and then eventually these little screens and stuff like that will start to get that gunk that I'm telling you about built up on them. But you can eliminate that problem by properly filtering the oil before you use it. So that's where we're at right there. This pump is also controlled by a triac circuit. You're going to only want to run this thing at about 40% power. That will increase the lifespan of the pump exponentially, and it also keeps it running a little bit cooler. Just you don't want to burn the motor up. There's no need to run it at full power, which is why I add this. That kind of cuts back on the power bill a little bit, and it just makes it a lot more effective all the way around, because now once you get this thing dialed in to control your fuel flow, you simply can toggle this knob right here. You don't have to mess with these valves anymore, not even this one here. So what I like to do once I get it started and get this thing primed, I guess I should start with the priming process first. What we would want to do to prime the pump is make sure that our flow is opened all the way. And that'll let air from the pump to exit out the nozzle in here. Otherwise, it won't prime, and that's one thing that gets people sometimes. This has to be open. This has to be closed. So we start the pump. We'll start to see oil flow. Once we know the oil is flowing through the nozzle, you can stop the pump, crack this nozzle here open just a little bit, and then you're going to come over here and you're going to close this nozzle all the way. You're going to turn the pump back on until you get the pressure gauge up to about 250 psis. And then you can adjust that pressure by toggling this valve. If the pressure is too high when you turn the pump on, just open the valve some. You can open it all the way and turn this on halfway, and then slowly close the valve until it gets to the pressure that you want. That's a good strategy right there that I often use. I just turn the pump on to where it's 50% power, and then slowly close this valve. And what that does is restricts the flow into the bypass and sends most of it out the nozzle. But once this says about 250 or so, you can then go over to this nozzle and just crank it open, like almost all the way, because we're not going to control flow with this nozzle here so much. And that should get you what you need to light this thing up. But you're first going to need to let this oil cell heat up to where it's almost too hot to touch at the end. That's a good way to know that it's hot enough. If you can just barely touch it, I prefer you use a thermal gun. 140 to 150 degrees is a real good temperature. It's going to be like a hot faucet is kind of where you want this. Otherwise, the cold oil just will not atomize. So this is kind of a must-have feature on this setup. So if I left anything out, let me know. You do need to get some fire brick to put in this thing as a flame target. that will definitely increase the longevity of the firebox here. I don't see you burning this thing out anytime soon, but still, the fire brick helps out a lot. So definitely do that. I would make it 2 bricks thick because it will start to melt that first brick. It gets hot enough to do that. So that's what we got. Let me know if you have any questions. This thing's going to be headed your way tomorrow, Scott. So this is kind of the setup I got in mind for you, Scott. I've made a little bit of a mess of the test rig here, but this thing is running really good with an oil preheater. We have a beautiful flame going inside of this thing. I have a fire brick target in the back. As you can see, we have no smoke whatsoever. Completely smoke-free combustion. And without this oil preheater, that's pretty much impossible. Definitely want to make sure this thing stays nice and warm. Oh yeah, she's staying hot. Not so much down below. Cold as can be right here. That is red hot though. So Rhonda, if you see this, this is also going to be what you're getting as well for your pyrolysis process. This is about the size of the firebox you described to me. So I think this thing's going to be perfect. I could probably turn the oil down a little bit, but I'm going to wait and just leave it as is. You can barely hear the thing. That's the coolest part about it.